Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving right into Franz Kafka's incredibly dense masterpiece, The Trial. We're going to unpack the modern anxieties of bureaucracy, surveillance, and, just that good old-fashioned existential dread. It's wild, because this story was published a century ago, but honestly, it feels like it was written about our modern world just yesterday. Let's peel back the layers on the intense psychological and institutional forces at play in this iconic novel. So imagine this. You wake up in your own bedroom, your safest, most intimate space, only to find out you're suddenly under arrest. For what? Well, nobody will ever tell you. There's no evidence presented, absolutely no clear accuser, and basically zero logical path to clear your name. How would you react to that? How long would it actually take for your confidence to just totally shatter? Because, well, that is the exact nightmare we are exploring today. Okay, here's our investigative roadmap for today. We'll start with the absurd arrest, move on to the architecture of alienation, explore the paradox of law, dig into the psychology of guilt, and finally zoom out to the human condition. Starting with Section 1, the absurd arrest, we really have to begin with the terrifying premise of our protagonist, Josef K. But before we get too deep into the weeds, we really need to define a term you've probably heard thrown around a lot, Kafkaesque. Basically, this describes a situation where an isolated protagonist faces a bizarre, surreal predicament and completely incomprehensible social or bureaucratic powers. Think about it. When a system makes absolutely no sense, completely refuses to explain itself, and yet somehow holds total power over your life, that is literally the definition of Kafkaesque. Moving to Section 2, the architecture of alienation. This is where we see how physical spaces actually reflect institutional invasion. Now, what's really interesting here is Kafka's brilliant use of spatial storytelling. Just look at the contrast. On one side, you have these intimate, mundane private spaces, right? Frau Gruberg's boarding house where Kay lives, the lawyer Hold conducting business literally from his bed, and the painter Tittarelli's tiny room. But then you contrast those safe havens with these massive institutional invasions. The courts aren't in grand buildings. They're shoved into cramped, suffocating attics of rundown apartment complexes. We even see brutal court punishments, like actual floggings, happening in a small junk room inside the very bank where Kay works. It's like the law is physically bleeding into the spaces of everyday life. So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that this system of justice is constantly, relentlessly violating personal boundaries. The novel literally begins with Kay being arrested in his own bedroom, and the executioners, they return for him right there at the novel's conclusion. Kafka is building a world where there is absolutely no safe haven from judgment. Your home is definitely not your castle anymore. It's really just another room where the system can observe and condemn you. Let's look at Section 3, the paradox of law. We're diving into the corrupted machinery of justice here. It's in the nature of this judicial system that one is condemned not only in innocence but also in ignorance. Wow. That haunting quote perfectly captures the core paradox of Kafka's entire world. Really think about what that means for a second. Accusation completely bypasses the need for actual evidence. You don't have to do a single thing wrong to be condemned, and what's honestly even worse, you aren't even allowed to know what the supposed rules are. The court doesn't actually seek out guilt based on facts. It's simply attracted to guilt. It operates as this unquestionable, invisible force. See, the law is supposed to be this divine, abstract ideal, right? Something that attempts to transcend individual cases and treat everyone equally. But here's the fatal flaw. It has to be enforced by a human court. And because it relies on deeply flawed human bureaucracies, the clerks, the guards, the judges operating in the shadows, it inevitably becomes completely corrupted. It just ignores the individual human case entirely. This creates an inescapable, deeply unjust culture where people's properties and lives are just taken. It's a huge paradox. The law cannot exist without the court, yet the court inevitably corrupts the law. Which brings us to Section 4, the psychology of guilt. Let's examine the inner collapse of Josef K. If we draw on psychoanalytic theory, particularly Freud's ideas about internalizing societal pressure, we can actually map out Josef K's tragic cognitive decline. It's a clear progression. It starts with confident irritation at his initial arrest. He literally thinks it's an absurd joke. But as that invisible pressure mounts, he shifts into desperate defensiveness, relying on absolutely anyone to help him. Obviously, this impossible struggle inevitably leads to massive emotional exhaustion. And finally, step 4, the constant scrutiny breaks his mind down into internalized guilt. He actually begins to feel like a condemned man, even though, remember, no crime was ever even stated. That persistent accusation, it acts like a psychological virus. According to researchers analyzing the text, this creates severe cognitive dissonance. Poor K is completely torn between his absolute belief in his own innocence and the overwhelming persistent reality of the court's accusation. And the tragic part is, the harder he tries to use logic and reason to defend himself, the more entangled and exhausted he becomes. The system doesn't even need to physically break him. The dissonance does the dirty work for them, ultimately convincing him of his own guilt without presenting a single fact. Finally, let's step back for section 5, the human condition. We're zooming out to the existential macro view here. Philosophers have been obsessed with this text for decades, and for good reason. K's nightmare perfectly mirrors our own modern anxieties. You have Jean-Paul Sartre noting that we are condemned to be free, meaning we carry this heavy, absolute responsibility in a totally ambiguous world. Then Soren Kierkegaard teaches us that true anxiety doesn't actually come from the fear of a specific punishment, but from deep, paralyzing uncertainty. And Martin Heidegger points to the concept of thrownness, which is just this terrifying reality that we are all essentially thrown into uncontrollable, massive situations that we have absolutely zero control over. And Kafka deliberately starves us, in K, of any comforting closure. Just notice the stark contrast in these final settings. First, K goes to the cathedral, turning to religion for answers. But the priest there, he only offers this cryptic parable that provides zero clear guidance. It's totally ambiguous. And this complete lack of meaning inevitably paves the way to the final setting, the stone quarry. This is where K meets his bleak, almost ritualistic execution. There's no grand revelation, no final understanding of why this happened to him, just pure existential dread and complete lack of resolution. Now, if there's one thing you take away from this explainer, it should probably be Kafka's terrifying realization about power. Oppressive systems do not require physical violence. Modern institutional authority controls us primarily through emotional exhaustion, unending surveillance, and uncertainty. Think about it. When a system makes you feel like you are constantly being scrutinized, you will eventually internalize that judgment. You will literally start policing yourself. So as we look around at our own incredibly complex society today, a world absolutely filled with opaque algorithms, massive bureaucratic systems, and constant 24/7 digital monitoring, we are left pondering a deeply unsettling question. If the rules are hidden and judgment is constant, are any of us truly innocent? Keep questioning the systems around you and never stop seeking clarity.